Greetings YouTube, Remarkable Republican here once again to bring you the truth with truth-flavored bias, and today we're going to take a look at the Jack the Ripper case. And when I say take a look, I mean take a definitive look, the last look you'll ever need to take. I've been doing research on this case for months, and I have come to a definitive answer, which is far better than anything that has previously been proposed. As you know, I am a businessman who specializes in a little bit of everything, and my sort of generalism gives me a scope of understanding that most of these so-called specialists just simply don't have. Anyhow, as I looked into this case, the truth became incredibly obvious. So what I'm going to do is walk you through how I figured this out. So let's start by looking at the generally agreed upon profile of what Jack the Ripper was like. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So let's take a look at the killer's profile as compiled by the Scotland Yard. And when criminologists put together these kinds of profiles, these things are about 99% accurate when it comes to predicting the psychological and physical state of the perpetrator, meaning the biographical details, broadly speaking, and this person's ability to think or their sort of mindset. What we see in the letters to the police and in the Ripper diary is an educated person who was slumming it with the mob, held them in contempt, and was deliberately trying to make himself sound dumber than he really was in order to throw off the hounds, as it were. And the thing is, when someone is deliberately dumbing down their vocabulary, what we see is that it comes off as super obvious because it comes off as very forced. And sometimes you can see little hints here and there that the person who is sounding this stupid is actually a little bit smarter than you might think. Another thing that we see with Jack the Ripper is that he was a strangler, and strangulation takes physical strength. So when we're thinking about the age range for Jack, the younger the better. And in the case of the person that I've identified, he was about 20 years old at the time, and that makes him a far better suspect than some of the ones who were, say, 35-ish at the time of these murders. Another thing that we can see when we look at Jack the Ripper is that just like the Zodiac and many other famous serial killers who got away, Jack was too smart to get caught, but also too sick to change his ways. There's no way that Jack the Ripper quit murdering after the Whitechapel murders of 1888. However, that passion for carnage would have to evolve, both because killers evolve in the way that they do what they do, and because, you know, as you get older, it becomes harder to do some of that kind of stuff. So what I propose here is that instead of becoming more vicious, as some killers do before they get caught, instead what happens with Jack the Ripper is becomes more subtle as he adopts a better disguise and finds better ways for inflicting carnage and mayhem on the world. So, now you're wondering, who is this person? Well, when the slide wipes, you will see the face of the person who was in fact Jack the Ripper. And here, ladies and gentlemen, is the face of Jack the Ripper from a photograph taken of him in 1921. Those of you who are a little more informed than most will recognize this face as a familiar one, because in fact, this man is conservative Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. Yes, that's right, Neville Chamberlain of World War II appeasement fame is in fact Jack the Ripper. How do I know this? I'm glad you asked. Let's go through the mountain of evidence as I show you painstakingly how I have come to this conclusion and why this conclusion is correct. Like any great storyteller, allow me to begin at the beginning. Neville Chamberlain was born on March 18, 1869 in Birmingham, England. Neville's father was a prominent figure in Birmingham, and their family basically ran the city. This Chamberlain family was extraordinarily wealthy and well-connected. When Neville was a young boy, his mother died, and this may very well have accounted for his anger towards women and his inability to approach women, because remember, the women that Jack the Ripper murdered were in fact prostitutes. So if Neville was going to London to approach prostitutes, this would sort of imply that he did not have a very healthy relationship with women and that he didn't really know how to talk to them. Normally, if you're someone who's rich and well connected, you can simply say, "Hey, my family runs the town, suck my cock." And that's about as subtle as you need to be, and you'll probably succeed. And I don't mean to be crass, but let's face it, we all know that that is the fact. Neville grew up with every advantage in life, and he never experienced any financial hardships until his early adult years, and as I'll show, even this supposed hardship that he faced is most likely a bullshit cover for him having to skip the country in order to evade investigation for a series of murders that happened in Whitechapel in 1888. One of the flaws in many Ripperologists' take on things is that they tend to count a lot of non-canonical murders. Well, that's just stupid, and I won't do it. I'm only going to look at the 5 canonical Ripper victims, since they're the only real ones. If we look at those 5 cases, what we see is that all of them were slain in the Whitechapel district of London between August and November of 1888. And in fact, we could even say September to November, since the first murder was on August 31st. At this time, Neville was a 20-year-old college student at Mason College in Birmingham. At first you might think, well, if the murders are occurring in London and he's all the way in Birmingham, how could he be the culprit? Easy. Travel by rail was cheap and relatively easy, so he visited London often, as young men did. This is where the action was. And keep in mind that although he was a college kid, at this period, the only people who went to college were rich people. So he was not broke. There was no such thing as a broke college kid. And he could easily afford rail fare to get to London on the weekends or pretty much any time he pleased. And as we'll see, he's a poor student. So the thing is, if he wanted to skip class and go to London, he could do that. There's no way to rule him out as not having been in London for any of these 5 murders. As someone who was really struggling in school and had other problems apparently, we see that Neville is someone who was in great need of an outlet for his frustrations. We also know that he hated women and that he had a lot of trouble approaching women. So all of this really fits together nicely. So let's move on and talk about the most mysterious and, I think, damning of all of these pieces of evidence. At the start of 1889, Neville Chamberlain was pulled from school by his father on the grounds that he wasn't doing well and he needed to spend his time more productively. So Neville was apprenticed to a local accountant, and this kept him busy for most of the rest of that year. Now, here's what actually happened. Neville's father found out through his contacts in London that Neville was a suspect in the Jack the Ripper killings. Therefore, he pulled him out of school and gave him a job to keep him more busy, because you tend to be a lot busier if you have a job as opposed to being in college. So that was a sufficient measure for a while. However, later in 1889, Neville's father decided that Neville needed to go to the Bahamas to work on the family plantation there and to try to restore the family's fortunes in the area. However, despite the fact that they claimed to have had financial hardships, there's no evidence that they ever faced any hardship at all. We'll see that Neville will go to the Bahamas. He wasted $50,000 of his father's on money, and dollars I mean pounds, excuse me. So you would think that's quite a bit, and that this would, when compounded with other struggles, really affect the family. However, when Neville gets home, everything is fine, which means that this entire trip was nothing more than a cover story in order to get Neville the hell out of town so that no one could ask more questions of him. If Neville's father did struggle for money for a short period of time, it was only because he must have taken out a huge bribe of one of the officials who helped him get his son off for these heinous crimes. After a few years of being completely terrible at business, which in my mind should have disqualified him from any form of public office, Neville Chamberlain purchased Hoskins and Company. This company made metal shipburbs and he managed the company for about 17 years. The company did well, but only because Neville had a lot of connections and he was able to get some corrupt government contracts from the Royal Navy. In 1906, Neville Chamberlain was one of 16 rich guys who founded the United Hospital Committee of the British Medical Association. And herein lies another key piece of damning evidence against Neville Chamberlain. We know that Jack the Ripper must have had some surgical training just based on the kinds of mutilations that he performed on his victims. And if Neville had some interest in this, which he clearly did, there's no reason to think that while he was at Mason College, he didn't take a class or two and know some really basic stuff. So again, this lines up perfectly with the idea that Neville was the perpetrator in London. And while this piece of evidence isn't quite as damning as the Bahamas period, it's still pretty damn bad, and Neville is looking guiltier and guiltier by the minute. One of the weirdest facts in Neville Chamberlain's biography is that he didn't get married until the age of 40. And when he did get married, Neville married his first cousin and then shortly thereafter gave birth to a son and a daughter. Why did he wait so late to get married? Well, it's very obvious. This late marriage was clearly a cover to give him respectability and prevent anyone from accusing him of being either a murderer or a homosexual, both of which accusations would have ended his political aspirations. In this period, also, it's important to note that it was very common for hidden homosexuals to marry their cousins to sire heirs, since if they had trouble in the bedroom performing with a female, most likely their cousin, who they would have had a friendship with for many years, would not gossip about it and therefore reveal that this person is in fact a homosexual. So, this is pretty obvious here. And if you know anything about a lot of serial killers, most of them do well when they just blend right in, whether we're talking about people on TV like Dexter or people like BTK out in Wichita. This is a common tactic for a serial killer, and Neville Chamberlain was really one of the innovators of this. Obviously, he never got caught as Jack the Ripper, so he pioneered this, and he didn't have anyone to base it on. So, grudgingly, you have to give him some credit for this, even though it's credit for something that's pretty terrible. So now that he has a cover for his long string of murders and his homosexual behavior, Neville Chamberlain is able to enter into politics, and of course he is extraordinarily successful from the outset because his dad owns the town. And what he becomes is effectively the Baron of Birmingham. He becomes the new political boss of an entire English city. Later he begins to emerge onto the national stage, and at this point, as he is becoming a senior MP with the Conservative Party, and the Conservative Party is really gaining ground, he's also entering into what I guess you could call late middle age. He'd be nearing 60 years old, so his physical prowess is dropping off. He's not as able to perform strangulations or kill people in other ways. I have to assume that he did keep killing for many years after the Whitechapel murders, simply because murderers of that nature can't simply stop. However, by this point, his passions would have cooled enough for him to rededicate himself to inflicting chaos in another way. And the way that he decides to do it now is through his political power. Now he can do this on a scale that he could previously only dream about. So this must have been the ultimate aphrodisiac for him, this level of power. And as he's really able to start envisioning and enacting this chaotic worldview, he must have been very excited. And we'll see that he did a tremendous amount of damage to the world with his killer tendencies and putting those killer tendencies with power. As we've already seen, by getting married and having children, Neville Chamberlain was able to disguise his homosexual lifestyle and his serial killing ways with being a family man who's just a good guy. And he also does a similar thing when he enters politics, because Neville Chamberlain's politics, at least the politics that he practices for the purpose of making the world worse and more chaotic, are left-wing. But he's able to sell those politics as being conservative, and he really pollutes the label conservative, and it's up to Winston Churchill later to rescue conservatism from the grasp of this maniac. When Chamberlain was Prime Minister, this was during the 1930s at the height of the Great Depression, and just like any true agent of chaos, Neville Chamberlain did the exact opposite of what he needed to do to get the job done. He passed pro-labor laws, so laws giving labor better wages and better working conditions at a time when you just need any job you can get. He's allowing workers to be extremely picky, so he's encouraging a culture of selfishness. He also provides paid holidays that the British people and the businesses that employ them could not afford. He also imposed rent controls to make sure that he screwed over all the property owners. And he passed other measures which stymied economic growth and prolonged the suffering, as well as increasing the oppression of the business class in England and driving them elsewhere. The most damning thing, of course, involved his foreign policy. On the horizon, Hitler was rising, and so was the Soviet Union. Yet, Neville Chamberlain cut defense spending in the 1930s. These cuts led, among other things, to the near cancellation of the Supermarine Spitfire, what would end up being Britain's best fighter, and the device that would effectively win the war for the British. The only reason that the thing came into being is because the builder was a fervent patriot who believed that it would be needed in the coming war, so he basically developed it on his own dime. No thanks to Neville Chamberlain, who simply wanted to keep Britain weaker so that way the alliance against Germany would have a more balanced fight that would go longer and inflict more death. If you look up Neville Chamberlain in the dictionary right now, you would see that his face is right next to the entry for appeasement. Neville Chamberlain's place in history was appeasing Hitler and tacitly encouraging him to rape, pillage, and plunder Central Europe. Neville deliberately ignored Hitler's aggression so that the resulting war would be more balanced, fair, and bloody. This is him underestimating Hitler's power and generalship and assuming that the French would be men like they were in World War I, rather than the craven cowards who surrendered after only a few weeks that they were in 1940. This psychopathic policy of appeasement is the ultimate meta level of greatness for a serial killer. By creating the conditions for a prolonged slaughter, Neville Chamberlain effectively managed to kill more people, British, German, and otherwise, than he could have ever done with a knife in the back alleys of London. So, in many ways, not only was he the first celebrity serial killer, but Neville Chamberlain ended up also being the greatest serial killer of all time by contributing to Hitler's mayhem. He effectively utilized Hitler as his new knife. Before we go, I would just like to present you with this image for your consideration. Neville Chamberlain, Jack the Ripper himself, standing next to Adolf Hitler. Two of the most evil men in modern history, the first serial killer and really the modern model for what a dictator is. Neville Chamberlain was such a high-level serial killer that not only did he get away with his crimes in Whitechapel in 1888, but went on in 1939 and 1940, actually even a couple years before that, To see in Hitler an instrument of death, a great knife that he could use to inflict random mayhem on men and women across Europe and indeed across the entire world. In many ways, Hitler was used by Chamberlain. Had Chamberlain stood up to Hitler harder, Hitler might have backed down early and we might have avoided World War II, which means that Hitler might have survived and left a stronger Germany behind to his heirs, and Germany might still actually matter rather than being destroyed the way that it is today. Anyhow, I just want to leave you with this image of two of the most evil men in history, because the truth-flavored bias is, it's hard to say which of them was worse. Anyhow, I'm Remarkable Republican, and I will come back to you in the future to unveil more truths with a truth-flavored bias. This is the end. I'm signing out.